So welcome to another fantastic Faena Rose event. Tonight we're here to have an incredibly timely conversation with everything that's going on in technology. The title of our conversation is called How Technology Will Change Everything. Again, because we know it has many times over throughout the course of our civilization, especially in the last 200 years. And we have Sean McManus, our friend, fellow Faena Rose member, who's going to moderate a conversation with
Dr. Eric Schmidt, the former chairman and CEO of Google, who's been an advisor to the US government and a serial author who has a new book called Genesis, Artificial Intelligence, Hope, and the Human Spirit. Pablo mentioned human civilization. We're going to find out tonight whether human civilization has much more time left.
You heard it. Get ready, as we like to say, to strap in and get ready for one heck of a ride. Another fantastic Faena Rose event. Thank you, amigo. All right, let's get into tonight because I'm incredibly excited for this conversation. We're going to start off with a 30-minute moderated conversation between Sean and Eric where you all will feel like a privileged fly on the wall, and then we're going to open it up to you. So we're going to give you the opportunity to ask questions. So during the course of the conversation, if something really catches your eye and you want to ask a question, please register it, and we're going to give you that opportunity. So without further ado, I want to introduce, first of all, a fellow Faena Rose member, a fellow friend, Sean McManus, who's also the co-founder of M+D, which is a strategic advisory firm. Previous to that, he was the director of programming at The Economist. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Sean McManus.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Pablo. And thank you so much to the Faena Rose team for having us here tonight. It is such an honor to introduce a New York Times best-selling author who also happened to run Google for almost 20 years, Dr. Eric Schmidt. Woo!
Sean, good to see you again.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for joining us. And, I was thinking a lot about kind of a narrative arc to help guide the conversation tonight. And as Pablo said, everyone's in a bit of a festive mood. It's the holidays. So I thought we could start out with some kind of warm and fuzzy topics and then scare the shit out of everyone. And then hopefully end on a more optimistic note before we close out. So how does that sound, everybody?
Hey. Yes, sir.
Eric, before we dive into your book, it's been about 5 years since you left Google and Alphabet to begin focusing more on your philanthropic work. You've launched a number of initiatives focused on finding, identifying, and funding the next generation of scientists and innovators and leaders. And so my question to you is, what is your philosophy around this work, and what do you hope to accomplish?
Well, thank you, and thank you guys for coming. The quick answer is, when you think about my success, it's fundamentally because of science. It's fundamentally because I was lucky enough to be born into the right family and the right educational system with the right scientific advantages, and everything sort of took off after that. So I'm now, I think, second or third largest science funder in the United States. And science can be understood as talent plus things, right? So talent is obvious. And America is a magnet for the best scientists, the best mathematicians, so forth in the world. It's very important for American strength that we continue to do that. And I fund a lot of human activities, various awards, various practitioners. We're talking about thousands of people. And I have no idea what kind of science they will ultimately do, but they're a hell of a lot smarter than I was. So each of these generations is just so much more impressive for whatever reason than the previous one. And I know what I was, and I know how much better than they are. The other thing I've been doing is trying to fund things in climate change, various physics problems, and so forth. And there I discovered I don't really like being a philanthropist. I really like building things. I'm sort of a builder. So I decided to build interesting things. So for example, I have a rule that I'll do anything that I can do that's 10 times cheaper than what the government can do. Okay, not 10%. Yeah. By the way, there's a lot. So I'm not talking about 10%, I'm talking about 10 times. And so I'm currently working on a design of a outer space telescope that would be launched from the local rocket company, and off we go. And again, using modern techniques, modern scientists, you can build them relatively inexpensive compared to what the government does. I can give you example after example. I've built a climate change monitoring system. One of the core problems with climate change is we don't have the accurate math and science around the real interactions at the hyper-local level. And so all of these decisions that the world will make about solar versus wind and so forth and so on are based on either poor science or no science. We're working on that. I mean, there's just a long list. I got extremely interested in the rate at which science will be impacted by AI. So remember that science does not change based on the faculty members, it changes based on graduate students. So the key idea is to fund the graduate students to apply AI to some problem. And I didn't understand this, but in most of science, they know the math because somebody 50 years ago did the formulas, and the formula is named after them. But the data computation is too complicated even for today's computers. But using AI, you can build approximations. With those approximations, you can solve the problem. Once the system understands it, it can also generate new candidates. So the basic rule is once you understand using AI, a system of organization like biology, which is poorly understood, we still don't even have a digital model of how a cell works, you can generate them. And so the power, once you can understand it and then generate it, is enormous. So this leads, and this is sort of the AI speech, do you want drugs faster? Do you want cures to every known human disease? I've got one project which claims, these are scientists, God knows, that they can find all human druggable targets within 2 years if we just fund a little bit more of their AI and GPUs. Like, that's a big deal, right? And we'll see, right? But the return for that kind of discovery is profound in medicine. There's lots and lots and lots of those.
Thank you for that. And you also find time to write books. The current book that we're going to talk about tonight, for a little while, just reached the bestseller list of the New York Times, the LA Times, and USA Today last week. So congratulations on that. And we'll talk about your co-authors in a few minutes. But perhaps the most provocative assertion that happens in the book Genesis, from my perspective, was the notion that since the dawn of human civilization, humans have pretty much found themselves at the top of the food chain. And perhaps that's changing, and changing pretty rapidly. So Eric, explain to us what you mean when you say that humans will no longer be at the top of the food chain.
So when I think about this book, the way I like to think about it is, and this is my interpretation, we're trying to capture all the benefits of AI while maintaining human values and dignity, right? And I think speaking as the local humans, we clearly care about that. In the book, we say there's a scenario where we are the dogs to the AI human equivalents. And so we as the top animals, if you will, in our 70,000 years of existence, whatever it is, have never had, like the Neanderthals were not quite at our level, shall we say. We've never had this arrival. And we spend a fair amount of time talking about what happens when that thing, whatever you want to call it, discovers things that we don't understand, right? And I'll give you some examples soon. And what does it mean to coexist? So this is not a book about how robots are going to take over your jobs, and then, as you know, in the movie, the female scientist eventually destroys the robot and wins the movie, right? That's not what we're talking about here, although it's a very good movie. What we're talking about is our coexistence with this. And the coexistence is very interesting. And before we talk about the negatives, which are much more interesting, let's talk about the positives. Now, you're in the production business, you do a lot of research, you write a lot. AI should double your productivity, right? It should allow you to run twice as fast, generate twice as many memos, do as many conferences, reach people, get twice as much reach. You personally should be able to do all of that. For each one of you, I can give you an example of a factor of 2, right? So I'm historically a programmer. Some of my code is still being used, which is sort of shocking. It's time to replace my code. But the important point is, if I were a programmer today, half my code would be written by the computer. It would finish my code, because I'm sort of lazy. I was a lazy programmer. So let's think about doctors. You can have twice as good outcomes or more. You can treat twice as many patients. If your goal is efficiency or outcomes, you can choose. What about lawyers? Well, you can sue people twice as much. You know, I mean, it seems like everybody wins, right? At least at the level of information workers. Now, there are jobs that are displaced, and everyone always says, well, what about me and my job? Like, I'm a programmer, my programming job's going away. That's not how automation works. Automation takes away the jobs that are the least human, the least interesting, or the most dangerous. That's always been true. This is just the same wave. So the important thing is that this underlying technological revolution is going to happen. And what I will say to this group is that this wave is happening much, much faster than you understand, that I understand, that governments understand. Our systems are not ready for this, right? It's simple things like copyright, right? How do you, the copyright, everyone, all the lawyers are worried about that. I'm not worried about it, they are. It's a legitimate concern. But what happens when your child's best friend is non-human? Those of you who have kids, you have a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, how do you feel about that? It's coming, and coming very quickly.
That sounds great.
Clearly, you do not have a 13-year-old.
I have a 12-year-old.
You have a 12-year-old. You want?
Yeah.
You're out with their friends and in with the new friend.
Out with the old, in with the new. So, in terms of what you might consider to be existential threats, your co-author, and by the way, we're bringing Craig Mundy here next month to Faena, so that will be very exciting. But let's talk about your other co-author who knew quite a lot about existential threats. Tell us, Eric, the origin story of how you met Henry Kissinger and began to develop a relationship with him.
So Henry was my best friend, and he, as you know, died a year ago. And to work with somebody of his brilliance is a special privilege. And my strong advice to you is if you know somebody who's that brilliant, especially if they're slightly weird, they need some help, talk to them, right? You will benefit so much in the mentorship and so forth. In Henry's case, I met him when he was 85 or so, and it was at a Bilderberg conference, which can be understood as a conference for old people, and he was obviously old, and I knew who he was, obviously, and chatted with him, and he said, I really have a problem with Google. And I said, what? He said, well, look at the results. And I said, well, I did. They look accurate to me, which is the wrong thing to say to Henry Kissinger. And so I invited him to Google, where he showed up and walked on stage and gave a speech, and he began by saying he was convinced that Google was a threat to civilization. And the Googlers loved it, because it made them feel important. So that began the process. And of course, Henry had to learn how Google worked. He didn't really understand how algorithms worked and so forth. He's, not his background, but he's a quick study. And what I learned, which is why the book is so relevant, is before any of us were alive, right after the war, he wrote his undergraduate thesis, which is the longest undergraduate thesis in the history of Harvard, on the relationship of reality and Kant. And he's very, very interested in human perception and how we perceive the worlds around us. And he became convinced 15 years ago that this online thing was going to do to us what it has now done. So, for example, I meet all sorts of people who seem to be confused between the difference between the online world and the real world. They get confused. They seem to be living in the wrong one and behaving in the wrong way. And this is going to be exacerbated by AI to a level that's hard for all of us to understand. So that's how it started. For the books, he wrote an article on basically the future of AI with my assistants, and then that got enough press. And he wrote another book on leaders, and his favorite leaders were Mao Zedong, Nixon, Anwar Sadat, Golda Meir. This is who he's writing about. And all anyone wants to talk to him about it is his AI article. And so he got the market feedback. He's like 95 and said, I want to work on this. So he wrote the first book and now the second book. He finished this, to be honest, a week before he died. He couldn't even get out of bed. That's how important this was to him.
I read that he died about a year after ChatGPT came out.
Yeah.
Eric, on the subject of Henry, and one of the other things that, as we know, Dr. Kissinger is known for is opening up China, and you're thinking a lot about the AI race between the U.S. and China, and you've been very clear on the fact that you want the U.S. to win in the battle against the battle for AI hegemony. So you and I were speaking of conferences, you and I were at a conference together in Beijing in 2019 that was hosted by Mike Bloomberg.
Yep.
And Henry was there. And what occurred to me at that event was that there's so much entanglement, right? It was meant to be actually a diplomatic back channel between US and Chinese CEOs. And my question to you is, how does the US position itself for victory in this battle when there's so much collaboration going on scientifically and in business between the US and China?
So Henry was very concerned that China and the U.S. would get in opposition on these issues. So he put together what is called a Track 2 dialogue, which Craig and I are now doing after Henry's death. And it's hilarious because we have like these meetings, and you have all the Americans on Zoom, and they're all dressed like us. And on the other side is a table, and the big guy is in the middle. They all are wearing the same suits, and they're all reading from their same scripts. So, and by the way, there are typically 9 to 11 of them. So it takes quite a bit of time to get through the meeting, and they don't say very much. And I said to him, this is what diplomacy is? He said, yes. I said, how did you get through 100 years of this? Yeah. Right? It's mind-boggling. But the stakes are huge. And let me give you a little bit of the background, and why, if it's okay, I want to explain why this is so important. When Henry and I his last visit to China was 2 summers ago, and I was there with him and we met with Xi and all the usual, people running the country with motorcades and the whole bit. And it was pretty clear to me at the time that they were 2 years behind. The way you find out what a country is doing is you don't ask the politicians, because they're either confused or won't tell you the truth, especially in China. But if you ask engineers a very precise question, they will answer your question. So the question to the engineers in China was, what are the scale of the training runs for foundation models? And the answer is there weren't any, and there were just one getting started. Fast forward to now, China has produced 3 models, something called DeepSeek, something called Quen, and something called Hongyang, and I apologize for the mispronunciations, which are at the same level as OpenAI's O.1, or close enough. That is a remarkable achievement. And in China, what happens is they have civil-military fusion, they have a 2025 plan, they've identified AI, they're going to dominate it by 2030, they're going to do it. There's no other country that can amass the money, the people, the knowledge, and the focus that China can. None. And the Europeans are largely hopeless, having spent lots of time working with them on this. They just don't have the money, they don't have the people, they don't have the energy, they can't do the financings and so forth, but China can do it. So it's going to be a US-China race. There's a separate question, which Henry and I were never able to resolve, which is what happens to the other 197 countries. Mm-hmm. But for those 2, it's that fight. Now, why is the fight so important? I'll give you a bit of background. So you all understand ChatGPT as language to language. If you want to know the ChatGPT moment for me this year, it was Notebook LM. And if you haven't played with it, it's a Google product. And if you're confused by what it is, there's just type in your favorite search engine, Notebook LM not human, and you'll find out why it's so extraordinary. It's essentially a way of looking at documents and media and analyzing them with a really fun way of presenting it. That's last year's. What's next year's are agents, large context windows, and automatic coding. Agents mean essentially a system with memory, so it gives input, It learns something by generating candidates. It tests things. So turn on and off the lights in the room. Eventually, it figures out that turns off that light, that turns, and remember, it learns in a microsecond, and then it produces its outcome. You can concatenate agents. And so almost every business workflow is an agent. So all the businesses that you're in will find themselves with agentic solutions where the agents will all be assigned to get the customer, bill the customer, service the customer, complain about the customer, rate the customer, so forth. All of that stuff. Do the accounting. There's a generally called a remote process automation or robotic process automation. That's going to be a huge category. The issue of context windows is the ability to use the systems for short-term memory. You can basically take what it said, feed it back in, and say, what do you think next? And the third one is automatic programming. One of the key things and I'll just give me 30 more seconds to explain. Because of those things, the following two facts are likely true. The first is, in the next year or two, we're going to have breakthrough super programmers, that is AI systems that are programmers, and we're probably going to have breakthrough AI mathematicians. Why? There are many, many areas that people are pursuing, but in software, it's essentially, they're called scale-free. If you're doing software, you can just keep making more software. You don't need to go consult something. And furthermore, you can run the software and you get a signal as to whether it works. So you try, you learn it, you're done. You try, learn something new. Try, learn something new. These computers are supercomputers that can do that in small numbers of minutes. And you have a polymath programmer. So much for my job. For a mathematician, the same is true because both mathematics and programming have a small number of language items and a clear objective function. And these systems that you hear about are built around next word prediction. It's simpler if you have a smaller vocabulary, and it's simpler if you have a training fund. It's easy if you understand it that way. Now, there's a gazillion startups that are doing both. They're going to be successful. When that happens, what do you need? You need programmers and math. Now, this is the slope of improvement in the US. This is the slope of improvement in China. The first one that gets to the ability to do the AI research agents, the slope changes. Because instead of having 1,000 programmers, which you have at Google or OpenAI or Microsoft or what have you have millions. You just launch them and say, try this, try that, and so forth. That slope, so you sit there and you go, why is he talking about the slope? In my world, if you're growing this quickly, your competitor cannot catch up. Because by the time the competitor gets next to you, you're already up here. It's crucial that America be the leader. It's going to be difficult enough with China as a fast follower. They work harder, their products are better, they're cheaper. There are all sorts of reasons why the Chinese are dominating this space. They have a different economic model. But if we don't get there first, we lose fundamental leverage of our educational system, our scientists, and so forth. Sorry for the speech. This is, I'm trying to get everyone in our government to understand this. And they all kind of go, okay, and then what do you propose? And I say, well, here's an example. There was a series of meetings last week on this in the government. Maybe you could do a deal with the tech companies. They need energy, and you need access to what they're doing. Maybe you can figure out a way to get them more energy, because these things are huge energy hogs, in return for some national security help. There's a deal to be done in the American system. They don't need to do a deal in China because they've already been brutalized to do it. They've been given billions of dollars, and they're going to do it or not. But they're on that path. We need to be on the same path.
Well, let me press you a little bit farther on that. So there's this tension then between the need for very fast-paced innovation to make sure that the U.S. wins the war on AI. There's also a need for regulation around some of the existential threats. And just indulge me while I tee this up for just a minute. Eric Schmidt was awarded the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Public Service for your work as chairman of the Innovation Board for the Department of Defense. You served as chairman of the U.S. National Security Commission for Artificial Intelligence. You served as a member of NASA's National Space Council. You are the founder and chair of the Special Competitive Studies Project, which makes recommendations for how to strengthen America's long-term global competition in the age of AI. And you served as the National Security Commission on emerging biotechnology. So as someone who's underqualified to really be making these kinds of assertions, hypothetically, if the president-elect had chosen you instead of Elon Musk to be a senior technology advisor, what would be, and you alluded to this, but what would be your first two very tactical recommendations?
Well, there's a long list, but in order for us to be successful as a nation, we have a deal between business, the universities, and the government. The government comes up with essentially at-risk money in various forms, and they provide a sort of a structure to operate in. The universities produce this incredible talent, and the businesses, through venture capital and so forth, then acquire it. That's how our national security works, by the way. The military doesn't actually build anything. They contract with private firms to build it. I know this because I spend a lot of time on it. So the first thing I would do is ensure that that model is strong. So what does it need? It needs more research money for universities. It needs more foreign visas for high skills immigration. It is, of the many stupid things our government does, the single stupidest thing we do is take somebody who's a math PhD and kick them out of the country. Mm-hmm. Now, by the way, you may not like them. There's plenty of states you can put them in if you don't like them, but keep them in a state in America. You see my point? It's insane. So, for example, the quantum initiative that China has was developed by a Chinese national who was trained in America. We wouldn't give him a visa. So he went back to China, and guess what? He's building systems whose jobs are to decrypt all of your communications using quantum effects. They don't work yet, thank goodness. Right? They've also launched satellites for quantum entanglement that the US hasn't done. That's not okay. It's just not okay. You know, wake up, guys. So I would first focus on that, to making that work. I think the second thing is that today economic growth and shareholder growth and so forth is coming from these very large tech companies. Now, there's many things they do wrong, but at the end of the day, they are national treasures. And I, for one, having been the CEO and chairman of one of them, I'm tired of people not recognizing. So, for example, during the COVID, I was largely here in Miami, and how did I get food? Amazon. Thank you, Amazon. Okay, thank you for making it work. They really were there, right? So you see my point. There's kind of this weird attitude. So I'm not suggesting that you give large companies unfettered access, but I will tell you that these are scale businesses, and the companies that win are going to be big, and you're going to have to deal with how to regulate them. I'm sorry to sound so corporatist, but I think that's true. Today, another thing I would do is, this is a much longer conversation. I've spent a decade working with our military. I'm a huge fan of our military people. I'm not a huge fan of anything else in the military because their systems are 1980s. There's an old joke that at the rate procurement is going, there'll be one airplane made. It will be used on Mondays by the Air Force. It will be used on Tuesday by the Marines. On Wednesday, it'll need repair. And on Friday, it'll be recertified. And on Saturday and Sunday, we take the day off. There's a real problem in the way we do our national security. I've been heavily involved with working with Ukraine and trying to understand autonomy and abundance, sort of what I focus on, my world. And it just makes no sense to build all these huge aircraft carriers and tanks and so forth. Tanks are very dangerous now because of drones. We should have major drone programs in America. And by the way, all of the current drones are dependent upon Chinese subassemblies. That's a problem. We need to fix that. We need to build factories to build the things for drones, for national security. I mean, I can go on.
Yeah. You had mentioned, and we're going to go to questions in just a few minutes, you had alluded to the fact that there is a whole world out there besides the US and China, and what those countries are doing to innovate or not on AI is critical, and as Dr. Kissinger knows, the world is safe when everyone is doing well and everyone is more prosperous. So Foreign Policy magazine just ran a story today saying AI is going to be very bad for the global south. What can the US do to ensure that there is an even distribution of prosperity from AI?
first place, I think these technologies are not very liberal in the way they work. They don't naturally produce equality. They don't naturally redistribute the gains. The fact of the matter is that a relatively small number of people and a small number of countries who move quickly and can operate at scale, which is sort of what I'm talking about for our nation, we win and everyone else can't keep up. They can't keep up because they don't have the economic systems, they are not smart enough, their educational systems aren't good enough, they can't get the data, or in Europe's case, they have stupid regulations which no one seems to be able to fix. So I spent a decade trying to get Europe to the table. Europe is not going to show up. And the reason they're not going to show up is they have lots of problems, they're not growing, everybody knows what's going on there, but they're not organized around innovation. So as much as we complain about America and everyone hates the politics, loves the politics, whatever, this is an innovation nation. And that innovation is it drives everybody crazy, but it also drives all of our growth. If you look at the Global South, the core problem is most of the population is in the North. Do you include India in the Global South?
Well, I mean, they would.
So India is an interesting case because India is a counterexample to this point. Mm-hmm. They're growing. I was just there for a week, very close to a bunch of the senior tech people there. And they have a shot because they have enormously brilliant institutions, IITs. Roughly half of the people in Silicon Valley that I work with are South Asians, technically, the Indian and Pakistanis and that diaspora. So I think India has a shot. I think China's going to win. Russia has essentially, because of the war, put itself into the Stone Age and gone back 20 or 30 years and done horrific damage. That's got to get fixed, but that's not recoverable in the short term. Africa doesn't have the oomph. So one of the questions that I don't know the answer to is, let's pick a nice, pleasant country in Africa that's agrarian, well-meaning, reasonably democratic. When this stuff shows up, what do they do? Now, if you look at Europe, the Europeans tried to have it all ways, which makes sense. They wanted to sell luxury goods to China, and they wanted cheap energy from Russia, and they wanted security from America. And that structure is unraveling economically. It's a hard problem. They're going to have a serious reckoning as to whether they want to grow or not. Mm-hmm. But one of the other rules about countries is grow or die. And here's why. In a democracy, you can't redistribute the money. So let's assume we have a fixed budget. So, you guys are in charge of this, you charge of that. And you and I are the elected officials. We cannot fundamentally take money from you to give it to them and vice versa. However, when there is growing money coming in from over there, we can add money to our pet projects or reward our voters or corruption or whatever it is. You would never do this. But if I were misbehaving, I could do that. But I can only do it when I have growth. Democracies need growth. They don't work without it. Autocracies are fine without growth because they're not voting, right? And obviously we want to be democratic. You have to, if I've learned anything in all of these years working on this, democracy is important and you have to fight for it. You have to fight for freedom.
So let's go to questions. And next, Eric, but before we do, just what do you say to some of the AI skeptics who talk about the pace of change being slower than you're anticipating, the incredible demand for energy, the incredible demand for computing power, frankly, the limits of human ingenuity hitting some sort of a wall at some point? Is there any chance that this is going to roll out a lot slower than...
Well, at the moment they're wrong, and it looks like it's underhyped. So the machine that I'm a part of is very good at announcing success before it delivers. Take a look at crypto, right? Crypto was going to take over the entire world. Speaking as a computer scientist, crypto is a great way of moving money around. It is not going to, with layer 2 chains, going to change the way we write programs. The latency doesn't work. All of us understood that, but the people promoting it still got valuations. But the AI stuff is real, right? It really does diffuse across every industry, every platform, and so forth, and it's a fundamental accelerant. Now, for each of the crazy initiatives. So for example, Elon is busy raising another $10 billion for what he's doing, doesn't have a lot of users right now. Most people would bet for Elon. He has a track record of delivering on these things. That's something we could debate. But what you can't debate is that not only is the usage there, I'll give another example. There are 320 million users of ChatGPT, and their revenue is $10 billion-ish. By the way, this product is 2 years old. 2 years old.
Yeah.
By the way, we should have invented it.
Yeah.
In fact, it's annoying that the people were at Google and they left to go to OpenAI and they invented it there. So Google has responded with what they claim is a better one, and that's how competition works.
Yeah.
But all of this has happened in the last year. And the next year, the arrival of these agents, broadly speaking, are going to transform everything. And so, for example, you'll have to have an agent orchestrator to determine which agents you use. You're going to have an agent store. You're going to have agent security frameworks. You're going to have all the things that you have for the equivalent of an app store. Plus, they have to be able to talk to each other. And one of the things I will tell you is that the agents will initially talk in English to each other, which is fine, because we can see what they're doing. When the agents on their own decide to come up with their own computer language to talk to each other, unplug them. You won't know what they're doing.
Eric, Miami's a real estate town. Real quick, tell your story about an AI agent building a new house.
No, this one's easy. I happen to like Florida. I happen to like Miami, and I want to build a new house, let's say, over there. So here's what I would do, right? I would say to a human, study the laws, look for some land, and negotiate the prices. Now, each of these is steps. And by the way, when you get the price negotiated, buy it, and then hire an architect and produce some plans, and then hire another contractor. And they're always overrun, so you have to watch them and all this kind of stuff, and eventually pay them and then take 20% away from them because they were late. It's sort of how it works, right? And then there's a big fight. Every one of those things is an agent. So the first agent is identify where we can build a nice house. The second one is analyze all of the overlapping laws, right? Nobody can understand. It takes a specialist to explain to you what the rules are about how high-end all of these things. The next one is to generate a design. These computers can generate really beautiful house designs, right?
Get ready.
They can. The cost accounting and all of the planning, that's pretty easy. Selecting a contractor, well, maybe the agent could actually go and call people on its own and get references and listen to them and listen and reason, because remember, these things are beginning to reason. Build the house. Take pictures of the house. If somebody takes pictures and gives it, the agent can decide if progress is being made or it's being lied to, right? Am I scaring you enough? I was in India and I met with two founders. These are young men who are obviously super smart. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, there's a lot of small businesses in India. I said, yes, there's like about 100 billion of them. There's like immense. And none of them have IT skills. And I said, yes, that's obvious. It's, Joe and Bob in Indian language live there. And it's their family business, and it's small. So they're building an application which you take pictures of the inventory, and that's all. So what does the system do? It takes pictures, it figures out what the business is. It can do that. It's easy enough. It can then do a calculation of inventory. It can do that. And then it can figure out which products are selling by watching the changes of inventory, kind of obvious. So it can build an inventory system. Now, in India, using it as an example, they tend to use WhatsApp Business to talk to everybody. So it can generate promotions and so forth on a per customer basis. Now, everything I just told you comes from a command, study my business and make me more money. That's the point. You're dealing with a human-like level of intelligence to solve an important problem that you care about. You can be very sure that every one of those companies would love to make 10% more just from taking pictures of their inventory.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as Dr. Kissinger knows, people with the profit motive is definitely going to be the complicating factor when we think about the robots running the world. Let's go to questions.
Right here with Jane.
Thank you. Hi. Oh, that's loud. Hey, Eric. Jamie,
Good to see you. Good to see you again.
Um,
We happen to be neighbors, so
Exactly.
we'll disclose this.
And I had the opportunity to interview you about 2.5 years ago for my firm, at which point this was the early days of the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and you made an interesting observation that you said the U.S. will not get involved militarily with U.S. and Russia will provide technology, but given the importance of the semiconductors, and Taiwan being the leading market share, if China goes into Taiwan, your prediction was that the U.S. would put boots on the ground and get involved militarily. Question is, do you still believe that is the case?
Well, we have a new president coming in who is historically opposed to these sorts of things, and he's unpredictable, so I don't think we really know. I will tell you, having spent a fair amount of time in Taiwan, they are incredibly good at hardware and not very good at software. So if I were in, thank God I'm not in charge of Taiwan, but if I were, what I would do is try to figure out a way to use automation to fight a much larger adversary. So all of the attack plans to Taiwan are believed to basically involve ships which are called ro-ro ships, where you basically roll on, roll off everything. It's a short distance from the mainland to Taiwan. Figuring out ways of stopping that would be an example of a deterrent. Most people think with Taiwan that it wouldn't start the way you're describing. That what it would really start was a cyber attack and then a blockade. And so I think I would watch for those steps. In the case of Ukraine, I don't understand this thinking that we don't care about this, because historically, for my whole life, the USSR and Russia has been our enemy with respect to dominance. And they've screwed with all sorts of things, like elections and so forth. And we all know this from our history. And this is not a comment about the Russian people, it's a comment about the Russian leadership. And you see this with Ukraine, where they commit war crime after war crime, because there's little old ladies in those apartment buildings that are destroyed, that they're destroying, and they're dying as you watch the bombardments. Having now seen war in real war up close, it's horrific. And it's important that we stop that, in the same sense that America got itself too far in Vietnam, and then we went through a 20-year period of reconciliation of what our view of all that was. And Russia needs to go through the same thing.
Eric.
Okay, there
Eric,
we go.
Dr. Farsi. Nice to see you again.
Nice to see you as well.
I'm going to try not to be long-winded. Preventable death in America is the third and fourth most common cause of death after stroke and after heart disease, right? And we know that the data sample is what make AI intelligence, or what make AI, right? How do we break the barriers on data sharing between a hospital? We know that Watson from IBM failed terribly at cancer. The next step is, how do we prevent increasing or moving preventable death through AI? I'm a very big AI fan because it could assist us in preventing death.
So when you go to a hospital, nowadays we have these large hospital systems that have their own IT systems, which look an awful lot like, to me, like an Oracle old traditional database. And these systems are more than just knowledge systems. They're revenue building systems, they're compliance systems, and so forth. The data is all in there. It's hard to get out. I worked a lot on building sharing protocols between all of them. There's a technology called FHIR, F-H-I-R, and so forth, which I worked on. And none of these things seem to address your observation. So I think that you have an economic system and a legal system which is preventing the sharing of data to solve real problems. So a simple answer would be to ask people by default, you are willing to share your medical data for research purposes, and you opt out of that as opposed to the inverse, that would probably generate enough data to do what you're describing. What I want is really simple. When I go to the hospital, it says, hello, Eric, and I have some problem. And it says, we've already figured out that you're going to have the next 3 problems. Because although you don't know them, there are 900 people who are just like you, and we have modeled that and we can predict it. And especially in acute care, something that you know a lot about, that could really save lives. The other thing about AI that's happening is you have continuous monitoring. So all of us have phones, you know, that you can do these EEGs on the watches and things like that. So having monitoring, AI-driven monitoring that's, again, agreed to by consumers is probably another big component. But the core issue here is the people who want to work on this cannot get the data to solve the problem. And without the data, you know, you're making it up.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. I have a question for you. Clearly, AI is going to create an enormous amount of value. I'm wondering if you could just talk about the AI value chain. And you know, the market has sort of anointed NVIDIA and Broadcom and Meta, and has sort of said Alphabet is not going to be such a big winner, and Intel will earn nothing. And I guess I wonder, where do you think the market has it right and wrong in the AI value chain?
Well, it's hard to know, because, and you know, betting against the market is always a mistake. NVIDIA is one of the most valuable companies in the world because of a language called CUDA. CUDA can be understood as the C programming language for GPUs. And they started building it, to their credit, in roughly 2007. And what happened was a very large amount of software was built on top of CUDA, and it's hard to move. So the logical competitor to NVIDIA is AMD, right, who are very well run. And they are working hard to make it possible to move between the two. So you can understand NVIDIA is a high gross margin, very important monopoly or monopoly-like system, because at the end of the day, if you're going to build a big data center, you need their hardware. There's an article, I don't know if this is true, but I suspect it's true, that all of the Blackwell B200s, which are the most powerful chips, are now completely sold out for the next year into 4 companies. Right, Elon, Meta, Google, and Microsoft, right, which all provides the services for OpenAI. So that's a way of thinking about it. Microsoft and Google have extremely large systems of training data. So Google, for example, has clicks from ads. Microsoft has equivalent things which are very large. They can afford 5 billion, 10 billion, 20 billion, 30 billion of capital because they can take that training data and produce real revenue. So at Google, for example, which I know obviously very well, just improving ad efficiency generates the shareholder value. So it's like a no-brainer. So for established large companies that have a digital presence and scale, they're going to really benefit. So that's the starting point. Now what's happening is every company is an AI company. So I went to Comdex for very strange reasons, and every company was an AI company, but none of them were doing AI. So you have to be super careful what you mean. To me, as an investor, one of my friends said, do you realize that $20 trillion will be made in the market, but it'll all be made in the big companies? And he was right. So the question for me now is, who are the next ones? And you have all of these candidates, you have thousands of them, and it's too early to tell.
Over there.
Thank you so much for joining us. Google's corporate motto was, Google's corporate motto was "Don't be evil," and it was then removed as the corporate motto. Do you have any comment on that?
I'm not sure that it was removed, but since I don't work there anymore, I shouldn't comment on it. But the joke about evil was, since we couldn't determine what evil was, Sergey would just decide. And that worked well for us at the time.
We have something over here. Yeah.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Hi, thank you. You've been talking about human-like processing, automation, AI agents, all those type of things. I'm myself in this industry, and I've been doing this for many years, and the issue is that by the time you have a working software and that you start pitching it to those companies and educate them. The software itself is not is already out to date, if I can say. How would you tackle this problem of having to teach them, explain to them all those education that you have to lose, the time that you have to lose, and at the same time produce and be able to still compete with others?
So when you say them, are you meaning humans or AI?
No, you have to train, explain and teach humans what it's capable of and what it does. And by the time you do, it's already out to date.
So I have a different idea of how this will play out, and we'll see if I'm right. It looks like AI systems will be able to figure out what you meant and not have to ask you all these stupid questions all day. So it looks like AI will be able to get the conceptual goal and then work out the details. That's a huge benefit to you and me, and I'm optimistic that. And the reason is that it's learning higher order patterns and it can learn higher order goals. We'll find out. I'm not as worried about this as you imply, because I think work will change as a result of it.
Thank you. So AI and quantum computing are both advancing rapidly, both primarily probabilistic systems. So presumably there will be synergies achieved in combining those two. In the medium term, where do you see the biggest gains in putting those two together, and how do you think that'll shape life?
So I looked at this pretty hard, because if quantum could do gradient descent at quantum speed, gradient descent is the underlying math that is in these models, then that would be a very big deal, because it would change training time from 6 months to 2 seconds or something. The consensus is it doesn't work, because the way the training works is it has to use huge data sets, and the stuff has to come in and out of the quantum computer, and there's no way to get it in fast enough. So I'm sorry to say, at the moment, I think quantum is important, but quantum is not fundamentally going to change AI. Whereas AI is enabling quantum simulation. I'm the chairman of a company called Sandbox, and the majority of their revenue actually comes from using GPUs to do simulation of quantum effects. So this is AI simulating quantum, largely for drug discovery, which is obviously a good thing to be working on. Most people think that AI will merge with one of the terms is neurosymbolic reasoning, which is another way of saying you have the AI system sort of doing language, and when it gets into a hard problem, it asks something what the answer is. It doesn't intuit it, it actually asks for the solution. And that combination is how most science will work. And my guess is, if you go back to my agent speech, that what will really happen is the large language model will be the supervisory layer, and it'll call agents as it needs. Like, oh, I have this interesting problem, let me pause and literally wait for the answer and then keep going.
Pablo? Let's do a couple more.
First of all, so Antonio Vasili, first of all, thank you very much for your technology optimism. I'm one of those computer scientists who exited Germany with a focus on AI, because I just thought it's far too slow, and I now live between Switzerland and the US, and I really appreciate that.
We're glad to have you, and we're glad the US lets you in.
Thank you very much. So actually I decided to do my doctorate on the focus of artificial intelligence and human collaboration to drive productivity, and I'm just in the process of collected all the data, and something really interesting came up. I gave a AI augmented group generative AI to produce creative content, and I had a control group who had to use traditional non-AI tools, still their favorite search engine, to come up with creative content. Now, the control group needed 2.5 hours to produce the content, and after that I had to cancel it because of fatigue and all these things which appear. The generative AI group finished everything with really high quality in 20 to 30 minutes. Both groups were really happy about AI being used in their job and during their task completion. But then something really interesting came up when I asked about employee satisfaction. The group which was using the augmented AI were actually dissatisfied about their job in general. They didn't like their job. They didn't thought their creative, mindset were used enough. They didn't, appreciate the tasks they were given. Whereas the control group was generally very, very happy about it. Now, there has been some data a couple of years ago published by some leading consulting companies that 75% of the digital transformation projects fail. And this is not because the technology isn't available, but because of human adoption. Now, with all the technology being available, how can we still make sure that the human adoption and the capacity of them is there? Because ultimately we need the humans to accept it and then change going forward.
So let me give you a cynical answer. Most software that's built is poor quality, doesn't work, too expensive, and you shouldn't have bought it in the first place. And when you talk to normal people as opposed to us, they all go like, well, what am I supposed to do? So I'm making an argument that the AI revolution will actually solve the problems, right, that humans asked for. That is my optimism. In your PhD, you should try to figure out is that possible, right? That's sort of the conclusion of your PhD. You have all this data. Can you, in fact, imagine a situation where the software works, right? I spend all day with people complaining about their software. Their software is buggy. The Chinese broke into the database. The database is too expensive. The dog ate the cable. What have you. It just seems like this is a solvable problem, at least in the domains of business, where you have an objective function that you can quantify. Remember that these systems train against an objective. So businesses are good because the objective of a business is customer satisfaction, revenue, earnings, shareholder value, whatever.
We have a question here.
Thank you, Dr. Schmidt. Doctor, thank you for being here. Stephen Shapiro. I serve as a senior advisor to the Atlantic Council, and you touched on an issue that is something that I've been working on and I'm concerned with. It's not an AI issue, but you did open the door. The issue is the relationship between national security and capitalism. Mm-hmm. And you proffered the idea that there's a deal to be made between the government and national security and the private sector. This concerns me because the Ukraine war has offered us a number of examples where that has entirely failed. At the outset of the war in February of 20, the president begged publicly the oil and gas industry to drill, big, drill, to reduce oil and gas prices to deprive Russia of an income. Likewise, the president publicly begged the munitions companies to put on a second shift. Both of these industries declined, saying the same thing. Well, it's not in our business plan. We've seen boom and bust cycles. We don't want to be part of that. Clearly what they were saying was that their own self-interest, which is acceptable because they're the private sector, was contrary to the needs of national security. Elon Musk, of course, is a walking example of the difficulties between the private sector and the issue of national security. His response was to shut off Starlink when Ukraine attempted an invasion of Crimea or at the front lines, and instead demanded what was the number, $100 million from the Department of Defense to turn it back on, just conveniently finding a glitch in the system. I wonder, given that your involvement in your intense involvement through the Department of Defense, of which I'm aware, could you comment on these contradictions, the difficulty we have competing with countries who can command their private sectors to perform, and we can't even beg our private sectors to perform when national security requires it?
So thank you. We have to unpack your question. I agree with some and not the others. If you look at China, I spent lots of time on this. China is rapidly advancing its military. And a non-classified way of saying this is they're very smart and they figured out where our weaknesses are and they're targeting our weaknesses, which is, by the way, what we would do if we would do the same thing. So that's kind of okay. In the examples that you used, ultimately the US military did a deal with Starlink, and that deal is crucial for the Ukrainians holding on. And indeed, Starlink is not available in Russia, which is a sore point for the Russians. So in fact, we can argue about the politics, But at the end of the day, Elon is a hero for what he did to enable connectivity. And I know because when I've been in the field and in the war, there's an awful lot of Starlinks that are being used for awareness. And one of the things that we don't understand about war is the first thing that goes is communication, right? And imagine if all of us lost all of your communication right now, like forever. How would you get yourself organized? We're too dependent on it. I think with respect to the military procurement, you're talking about old industries, and I'll just be blunt, they're not particularly innovative. They're located in the state with a powerful senator. They don't work that hard. The demand signal is straightforward. They have one customer and so forth. And now all of a sudden have this crisis. My favorite example was that for a while in the war, they were using Stinger, I guess shoulder-fired missiles. I can't remember the name. And those missiles, we ran out of them. And it turns out the manufacturer had shut down the production line, right? So they were asked to restart it, but it takes a year to restart a production line. So, and didn't have the people and so forth. So this is just a bad way to run national security. So here's my proposal. So first, just showing you my own biases. First place, we need to be the winner in autonomy. We need to be the winner in abundance. And autonomy means unmanned systems, uncrewed systems in the military terms, unmanned system, whatever, that are automatically controlled by AI to keep us safe. This is quite obvious if you think about it. It's how you defend the line, it's how you attack, it's how you watch for things. It's true for national security, it's true for criminal behavior and so forth. Drones are that powerful. You see this with everybody being spooked by the drones in New Jersey, which don't seem to have done anything to anybody yet. We'll see what happens there. So, but it's real. So from my perspective, the right thing to do is to create a set of factories in America that can make millions of those on a dime, because that's the future, right? In our case, we essentially ran out of 155s, which are these big pieces of artillery. The Russians and the Ukrainians use 152s, which are slightly different sizes. When you watch artillery, you have a soldier who's 25 or 30 who's using a little periscope thingy for the azimuth of the artillery. The artillery piece was made for him, made in the 1940s, right? And the funny thing is, I was watching one of these, and after whatever they were doing is done, everyone's relaxed. They all take out their iPhones and take pictures of each other. So you want to see a contrast between old and new? Look at it in artillery. Artillery is a really bad idea. Just use drones.
So let's have one more question, and then Eric will be around for a few minutes afterwards.
Over here, Sean.
Okay.
To your right.
Right here.
Eric, you mentioned recently that when AI gets to a point where it can improve itself, maybe faster than humans can, that we should just unplug it. I'd love to know how you think about how we should regulate AI.
Yeah.
And I'd also ask, in a world where China is not regulating it, how do we move forward?
I think there are plenty of issues to regulate an AI, but it's important to not do what Europe has done, with they overregulate and they stop leadership, especially given the Chinese competition. So my current view, which I think is consistent with President Trump's view, is let's let this thing run. Let's run as hard as we can. In order to believe that, you have to believe that the American companies are not going to do anything too criminal or too insane. And speaking as an executive for a long time in a number of them, they won't, because they get sued to death, they have shareholders, and they're Americans, right? So for all of the people who say, well, we can't trust them, well, who are you going to trust, right? I'd rather trust them because there are repeatable loops of control on them. So I think my general answer is let the race go. Let me tell you the points at which you should seriously, and the unplugging is a joke, although unplugging has some benefits. And you remember that the computer might learn that it could get unplugged and then, screw with you.
Yeah.
When recursive self-improvement occurs, recursive self-improvement is where the model is getting faster, learning itself, and you don't know what it's learning. That's a moment. Another one is if the model learns how to exfiltrate itself. That is, it decides on its own to make copies of itself. That's a danger point. Another one is it decides that it's interested in getting access to weapons. It's read, remember, all those books about all the wars, and it thinks, well, these weapons are interesting, I should have some. That's another example where it's time to stop and really rethink the control architecture.
Eric, as the last question, let's, related to yours on a philosophical and spiritual note, you write about the notion of doxa, which is kind of an unwritten morality that guides human nature, that helps keep societies functioning. And as an alternative to unplugging, there's maybe potential to teach AI to operate through doxa. Talk about that.
So Anthropic, a very clever startup, decided to write a constitution, which looks a lot like a democratic constitution. It's pretty straightforward. And they fed it into the model, and they said, you have to follow this constitution. We like that. Mm-hmm. So doxa is a term that you probably don't hear very much. It's a term that describes the unwritten rules of a society. Now let's think about all the unwritten rules that are true in America, right? A lot of them come out of religious texts or your parents or what have you. So it makes sense to me that an AI system could actually learn those rules too. And if it can learn it, then you can enforce it. One of the questions that Henry and I talked a lot about that we don't really understand is, we now understand that language across every language is much more similar than linguists thought. Once you can translate one language into another, you can translate every language into everyone else. Now that's interesting. That's a structure. Is it also true that human dignity and morality has a similar structure across all societies? My opinion is it is. So let's imagine that we set out to discover that, right? And I'll give you a simple example, something like the 10 Commandments, don't do evil, don't steal, don't steal the bread, whatever. Those kinds of rules, which are sort of imbued in our culture, there are similar rules in every human culture. So maybe there's a way to discover the way we really work, this is the goal, and then enforce it on the AI systems. And the way you do it, by the way, is you don't enforce it on an AI system, you have a supervisory system that checks the AI system, because humans can't move as quickly as the AI. But another system that's the enforcer, now that would be a fun project. We don't know yet, but it's exciting research.
Well, we will all say a prayer tonight that you might be right and this might work. What a privilege, Eric Schmidt. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you for everything. This is a great group.